Last week, 47 families gathered outside the White House. They were not protesters in the conventional sense. They were parents, spouses, and siblings of American service members killed in military operations against Iran over the past 6 months. Each one held a photograph. Marine Corporal Ryan Mitchell, age 23, killed when an Iranian missile struck his forward operating base. Navy Lieutenant Sarah Chen, shot down over Iranian airspace, captured, and later confirmed dead. Army Specialist Marcus Thompson, killed in a roadside attack while escorting a supply convoy. 127 names, 127 families, and one question that none of them had received a satisfactory answer to: why did my loved one die? The gathering was organized by a group calling itself Families for Accountability, formed 3 months into the conflict by relatives who shared a common frustration. They had been told their family members died serving their country. They had received flags, medals, and condolence letters from commanding officers and elected officials. But when they asked what strategic objective had been achieved by those deaths, what mission had been accomplished, what vital national interest had required the sacrifice, they received vague answers about deterrence, regional stability, and defending American interests. None of it was specific. None of it was measurable. And none of it explained why their son, daughter, husband, or wife would never come home. Linda Mitchell's son Ryan had enlisted in the Marines straight out of high school. He was deployed to a forward base near the Iraq-Iran border as part of a Marine expeditionary unit tasked with what operational orders described as force projection and presence operations. On his 3rd week in country, an Iranian ballistic missile struck the base, penetrating a hardened shelter where Ryan and 11 other Marines were sleeping. The strike killed all 12. Linda received notification 2 days later. The official statement described the attack as an enemy action during ongoing military operations. It did not explain what mission the base was supporting, what objective the presence of Marines at that location was intended to achieve, or how Ryan's death advanced any defined strategic goal. She began asking questions. She contacted her congressional representative, who expressed sympathy and promised to look into the matter. She reached out to the Marine Corps Liaison Office, which provided information about burial benefits and survivor support but could not articulate a clear operational rationale for her son's deployment. She watched press briefings where Pentagon spokespeople described ongoing operations as successful and necessary, but never defined success or explained necessity in terms she could connect to her son's death. Through online forums and social media groups for military families, Linda connected with others asking similar questions. Sarah Chen's father wanted to know why his daughter, a highly trained Navy pilot, had been sent into airspace where 8 other U.S. aircraft had already been shot down, with no effective air defense suppression and no clear target that justified the risk. Marcus Thompson's wife wanted to know why supply convoys were being routed through areas known to be under Iranian fire, when alternative routes existed that were longer but safer. The families were not anti-war activists. Many were from military backgrounds themselves. They understood risk and sacrifice, but they also understood that military operations should serve defined objectives, and that losses should be weighed against strategic gains. What they could not understand was a conflict where the objectives seemed to shift, where success was never clearly measured, and where their questions about purpose were met with platitudes about patriotism and service. The group grew. Within 2 months, over 200 Gold Star families had joined. They began organizing. Not protests in the traditional sense, but public appeals for transparency and accountability. They wanted answers to specific questions. What is the defined objective of military operations against Iran? What conditions constitute mission success? What level of casualties is acceptable in pursuit of those objectives? And who is responsible for making those determinations? The gathering outside the White House was their most visible action to date. 47 families, representing a fraction of the total but enough to draw national media attention. They stood quietly, holding photographs of their loved ones with signs asking simple questions. What is the mission? What did my son die for? Why? The images were carried on every major news network. Linda Mitchell was interviewed by CNN, standing in front of the White House fence, holding a framed photograph of Ryan in his dress blues. The interviewer asked what she wanted from the administration. Her answer was direct. I want someone to look me in the eye and tell me what my son's death accomplished. Not that he died serving his country. I know that. I want to know what objective was achieved, what mission was completed, what threat was eliminated. And I want them to explain why that objective was worth my son's life. The interview went viral. Within 24 hours, the clip had been viewed over 10 million times. The comments section filled with messages from other military families, veterans, and civilians, many expressing the same frustration. The question resonated because it was unanswerable. 6 months into sustained military operations, there was no clearly articulated strategic objective. Operations were described as degrading Iranian capabilities, deterring aggression, and protecting American interests. But degrading to what level? Deterring what specific actions? Protecting which interests, and from what threats? The White House response was carefully worded. A spokesperson expressed deep sympathy for the families and gratitude for the sacrifice of their loved ones. The statement emphasized that military operations were conducted to protect American security, and that every loss was felt deeply by the president and the entire administration. But it did not answer the question. What is the mission? What defines success? The statement said nothing that could be measured or verified. Congressional reaction was more substantive but politically divided. 23 senators from both parties issued a joint statement calling for hearings on the legal authority and strategic objectives of operations against Iran. They noted that while the president had broad authority to conduct military operations in defense of national security, sustained combat operations approaching the scale of a war required congressional oversight and, arguably, authorization under the War Powers Resolution. The families testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in closed session. Their testimony, later summarized in public statements by committee members, focused not on policy disagreements but on basic questions of accountability. If the United States was engaged in military operations that were producing casualties at a rate of over 20 deaths per month, what was the strategic framework guiding those operations? What were the metrics for success? And who was responsible for determining when those metrics had been met and operations could cease? The testimony had political impact. Public opinion polling conducted in the week following the White House gathering showed a sharp decline in support for continued military operations. 6 months earlier, 52% of Americans supported military action against Iran, with 34% opposed. The new polling showed support had dropped to 34%, with 61% now favoring immediate withdrawal. The shift was driven primarily by independents and moderate voters who had initially supported a strong response to Iranian actions but were now questioning whether the response had a coherent strategy or endpoint. The families were not coordinating with any political party or advocacy organization. Their message was nonpartisan. They wanted accountability from whoever was responsible for decisions that had resulted in their loved ones' deaths. But the political effect was undeniable. The administration's handling of the conflict, particularly the lack of clearly defined objectives, became a central issue in political discourse. Social media amplified the impact. The hashtag #WhatIsTheMission trended for 3 consecutive days. TikTok videos created by younger family members, some of whom were in their 20s and fluent in the language and aesthetics of the platform, reached audiences that traditional media could not. One video, created by the daughter of a killed Army officer, featured her scrolling through official Pentagon statements about the conflict, stopping on phrases like ongoing operations, degrading capabilities, and protecting interests, and asking after each one, "What does this mean? How do you measure this? When does it end?" The video was viewed 15 million times in 48 hours. The administration faced a dilemma. Ignoring the families was politically untenable. Gold Star families command deep respect across the political spectrum, and dismissing their concerns would be seen as callous and disrespectful. But engaging directly with them required providing answers that the administration either did not have or was unwilling to articulate publicly. The strategic objectives of the operation had never been clearly defined, in part because the operation had evolved from initial strikes in response to specific provocations into a sustained campaign without a clear endpoint. Attempts to arrange a meeting between administration officials and family representatives faltered over the format and substance. The families wanted a public forum where their questions would be answered on the record. The administration preferred private meetings where expressions of sympathy and general policy discussions could occur without creating soundbites that would dominate news cycles. The impasse reinforced the perception that the administration had no good answers to give. Iran, monitoring the situation through both intelligence channels and open-source media, recognized the strategic value. State-controlled media outlets broadcast extensive coverage of the protests and interviews with family members, emphasizing the theme that even Americans were questioning the purpose of the conflict. The messaging was aimed at both domestic Iranian audiences and regional populations, framing the narrative as one of American confusion and declining will. Iranian officials made public statements expressing sympathy for the families and suggesting that their grief was the result of an unjust war initiated by a government that could not even explain its own objectives. The families were aware that their message was being used for propaganda purposes. and some expressed frustration that their genuine questions were being exploited. But they also noted that the propaganda was effective because it highlighted a truth. 6 months into military operations, the United States government could not provide a clear, public explanation of what those operations were intended to achieve. Military leaders, active and retired, began weighing in. Some defended the administration, arguing that strategic objectives in complex conflicts cannot always be reduced to simple slogans and that operational security sometimes requires limiting public discussion of specific goals. Others, including some who had recently resigned from command positions, supported the family's call for greater transparency. One retired Marine general, speaking at a public forum, stated, "If you cannot explain to a mother why her son died in a way that makes strategic sense, then you should not have sent him into harm's way." This is a fundamental obligation of leadership. The casualty figures themselves became a point of contention. Official Pentagon reports listed 89 combat deaths over the 6-month period. But Families for Accountability compiled their own count based on notifications received by members and death notices published in local newspapers, and their tally was 127. Discrepancy appeared to stem from different categorization methods. The Pentagon counted only deaths directly attributable to enemy action in designated combat zones. The family's count included service members who died from injuries sustained in theater but who were medically evacuated and died in hospitals outside the combat zone, as well as deaths attributed to accidents and non-combat causes that occurred during deployment. When confronted with the discrepancy, Pentagon spokespeople acknowledged that different accounting methods could produce different totals, but maintained that the official figure of 89 combat deaths was accurate according to established reporting criteria. The families argued that this was a distinction without a difference. If a Marine was injured by an Iranian missile and died 2 weeks later in Germany, that death was a consequence of the conflict regardless of how it was categorized for statistical purposes. The debate over casualty figures reinforced the broader theme of transparency and trust. Families who had lost loved ones felt that the government was minimizing losses to manage public perception rather than providing complete and honest accounting. This perception, whether fair or not, deepened the sense that the conflict was being conducted without adequate oversight or accountability. As the protests continued and media coverage intensified, pressure mounted on Congress to take a more active role. Legislative proposals were introduced requiring the president to submit a detailed report on the strategic objectives, success criteria, and estimated timeline for operations against Iran. The proposals faced political obstacles, with some members arguing that such requirements would undermine executive authority and operational flexibility. But the family's presence as an organized and sympathetic constituency made it difficult for legislators to ignore the demand for greater accountability. The question remained unanswered. What is the mission? For the 47 families standing outside the White House, and the hundreds more they represented, the absence of an answer was more than a policy failure. It was a betrayal. Their loved ones had died not in defense of a clearly defined national interest, but in service of objectives that were either unstated or incoherent. And 6 months into a conflict with no end in sight, nobody in a position of authority could tell them why.